So a couple of things. We should probably, without taking too much for granted, we should probably just define BRICS. It's an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. Jim O'Neill and some partners came up with it. And all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders, and said, well, who's left? That will be the up-and-comers, the fastest-growing developing economies. And they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favor to South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you probably can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. So for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meeting, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes there are 3 or 4, say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they sat down and they said, we actually have a lot in common, a lot to talk about, and we added it up. We're a pretty powerful group. So they formalized it. And then in 2009, they had a summit conference, a formal summit conference with an agenda and all that in Yekaterinburg in Russia, in the Russian Federation. And they solidified, okay, we're a group, we're going to work together. And they did. And over the coming years, they multiplied numerous. People say it's the BRICS meeting. They have about 190 meetings a year. They have working groups on women's rights, sports, the environment, climate change. It could go on and on. It's a very active, what they call secretariat, which is central organization. A few years later, in 2014, they formed what they call the New Development Bank, NDB. Well, what's the New Development Bank? First of all, it's got 100 billion of capital, part paid in, part callable, but it also has borrowing power with that kind of ownership and that kind of capital on the balance sheet. They've got hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing power. They could easily get a pretty good credit rating. And the purpose is to make loans for development projects to the member countries. And by the way, there are stockholders of the New Development Bank who are not BRICS, but they're kind of in the club. Well, what does that sound like? The World Bank on their own terms with their own governance. Okay, the following year, they created something called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Well, what's that? Again, they threw in a couple $100 billion from the members. China was the biggest contributor. Again, with borrowing power, so take a couple $100 billion times 5 or 10, that's your power. And this institution was designed to be a swing lender to members who were running trade deficits or facing a run on their currency or facing the prospect of having to close the capital account. Exactly what we saw in 1997, 98, by the way. I was there for that one. We ended up with long-term capital. Well, a pool that is a swing lender to countries with balance of payments deficit, what does that sound like? That's the IMF. So basically, they copied the World Bank, they copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland putting on a play. This has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They're very methodical. So they duplicated the World Bank. They duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership. And there are, I think, 21 or more countries who have applied. Well, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted, starting with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. You can debate the method, but just if you do purchasing power parity, you get over half of GDP, 30% of the global landmass. I could go on and on. My point is, I learned development economics in the 1970s. We had something called the third world. It was like, it was Russia or, Soviet Union and the US. And then there was the third world. And all you knew about them was they were poor and, you had to get them off the runway. We actually had the runway theory of how you'd grow. Turned out to be wrong, but that's what we learned. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military. And again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call, US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. So that's who this group is. Now, there are a couple other groups that may join forces with the BRICS. There's something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Everyone's like, what the heck is that? Well, this goes back to the early 2000s. This was Putin's answer to the EU. He said, well, you got the EU, we got the EEU. Now it's Russia and some Central Asian republics, some, Belarus and Tajikistan. I'm not saying this is France, Germany, and Italy, but it is a group that have reduced tariffs and improved trade between themselves. And there's another powerful group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China. And these are mostly Central Asian republics, including Kazakhstan and some others. But they're all talking to each other. Now, what's the common denominator? Well, it's basically Russia and China. China's a member of two. Russia's the only country in the world that's a member of all three. So through pretty simple inference, you could say, hey, Russia and China are running the show. And it's very likely that when this thing plays out, and I'll talk about the thing, I realize we're glossing over that, but when this new currency plays out, that those other countries will join in. When you do that, and I found a really cool widget. It's a map of the world that's blank, and you can go country by country and fill in by color. Just click on it and give it a color. And I did that. And I was like, okay, here's the BRICS, it's 5 countries or whatever. Well, here are the applicants, it has another 20. And here's the SCO, a few more. Some of them are members of both. Here's the EEU, has a few more. Again, many are members of both. And you keep going. And all of a sudden, like a light bulb goes on. I said, that is Halford Mackinder's global island, what he called the world island. And this goes back early 20th century, first, probably greatest geopolitical theorist in history. Got to read his book if you haven't read it. It's pretty short. But he had this idea of the world island. That is exactly what they're building. Now, why is that important other than the obvious, which is more collective economic and population power? By the way, output of wheat, pick your metric. This dominates the world. Well, for one thing, if you're going to have a currency union, the more countries you have, the more likely you are to be successful. Let's just kind of digress for a second. And what are the headlines saying? China and Saudi Arabia are talking about selling oil for yuan. Brazil and China do large multi-currency deal where they accept each other's currency. UAE, China, same thing, selling oil for yuan. Russia, China, using yuan and rubles as payment methods for whatever they sell to each other. Russia sells natural resources, China sells semiconductors, manufactured goods, and so forth. And there are a number of those. I don't have to list them all, but there are 10 or 15 of these. The reason they've all fallen short, and very few of them have actually come to fruition despite the headlines, is when you have two countries and they're going to trade with each other and accept each other's currency, and you can do that, you're limited to what you can do with that currency. This is why the Russia-India thing is starting to break down. Russia's been pumping oil to India. India's been paying in rupees, but how much curry do you need? And Russia's starting to balk. They're like, hey, we're up to our eyeballs in rupees. We need a better system. Well, when you have a multilateral, multi-country currency union, that problem goes away. Now, Russia sells oil to China. China pays in BRICS, the BRIC currency, pays you in BRIC. But Russia can take the BRIC and turn around to Argentina and say, we'd like to buy, or Brazil maybe, and we'd like to buy some Embraer aircraft. And Brazil gets the BRIC currency, and they can turn around to China and say, we'd like to buy some rice. And then China takes, et cetera. And so you've solved the quasi-barter problem.